let me just extend my welcome to all of you. It might be morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome, you're very welcome to this webinar. My name is Amy Bradley. I'm a member of faculty based at the Hull Ashridge campus. Just a quick introduction from myself. I work across our undergraduate, postgraduate, executive education and doctoral programs. My interests, I suppose, would span three broad areas in the work that I do. The first interest is what I call crucibles of leadership. And a crucible is a container in which metals or other materials are melted down to create something new. And my term crucibles of leadership is a metaphor for turning points in our lives. And this is one of my areas of interest, the experiences we all go through at some point in our lives, be it a bereavement, an illness, or family breakdown, for example. These experiences can profoundly shape our sense of ourselves and how we relate to others. And I'm interested in these experiences and how they affect the way we lead in particular. My second area of interest is engagement. And I'm particularly interested in how we can create contexts where people can bring their whole and fullest selves to work every day. And my final area of interest is a topic that is very close to my heart, and the topic of today's webinar, compassionate leadership. So let me just move into the slides. For those of you who may not know us well, I just wanted to open up with a brief explanation of who we are at EF and Hull Ashridge and what we do. At Hull Ashridge and EF, we're part of the world's largest education company, which means we're able to offer a whole range of services, from language training, cultural exchange programs, and educational travel, through to leadership development and digital learning. At Hull Ashridge, we're one of a very small number of triple accredited international business schools worldwide. We've been working with leaders for over 60 years now and have campuses across 4 continents. And I'm delighted to say that yesterday, the Financial Times again ranked Hull Ashridge in the top 20 schools in the world for executive education. And we climbed 3 places to number 16. I also just want to give you a sense of my intentions for this session. I'll be talking for around 35 to 40 minutes, and I'm going to leave some time at the end for questions. Unfortunately, due to the sheer numbers on this webinar, it's fantastic that we have so many, but that means I'm unable to have a conversation with each of you in turn. So I just wanted to say that if there's anything that I raise or talk about in this session, please feel free to send me a message on LinkedIn or email afterwards if you'd like to pick up a conversation on any of the points raised today, or if you do ask a question at the end of the session and I'm unable to get to that question, do feel free to contact me and ask me that question after the session. So in a second, I'm going to open with some initial questions for you. I'd like to run a short poll in a second, just to get a sense from you as to where you're at in your own organisations when it comes to this topic of compassion and compassionate leadership. I'm then going to present some thoughts on how I think the current crisis, the current pandemic is changing leadership. I personally think this is a watershed moment. And by that I mean, I think we'll look back on this time and see our lives as a before and after this pandemic. And this current crisis will be a marker in time that we'll look back on. And I really believe this watershed moment is bringing humanity to the fore and gives us an opportunity to rewrite what we see as good leadership. So I'm going to be talking about that and how I think the current pandemic is shifting leadership. Before I talk about the skills that lie at the heart of compassionate leadership in particular, I want to talk about a concept called human moments. Human moments, it's the topic of my recent book that was released just before Christmas. And human moments are simply making the time each day to connect with someone at a basic human level. And I'm going to tell you about my own personal journey to compassion and some of the human moments that have been important to me along the way. And then I'm going to close the session with some insights from what I call consciously compassionate companies. Spontaneous acts of compassion happen between people every day, but I'd like to share the sense of what happens in organisations when compassion is truly embedded. And compassion is what I call systemic, so it's system-wide across the organisation, and also systematic. So people can expect to be treated with kindness, whoever they are and wherever they are in the organisation. So I'm going to be closing with some insights from consciously compassionate companies. I just want to say that this short webinar is not a complete learning experience for you. At Hull Ashridge, we run a range of interactive and experiential online sessions, and this is just a taster of the kinds of questions, perspectives and conversations that we elicit on these virtual workshops. So if you would like to find out more about Hull online skills, just speak to one of our advisors, and we'll also include a link to our website in the chat box and make that available to you. Okay, so I hope that sounds okay as a plan. I'm just going to move into the opening part of this session, and as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to open with some questions for you. And in a second, my colleague is going to launch a poll, and you'll see it pop up in your screen. There's 3 questions in that poll, and I would love you to answer each one of those. So my colleague Sophie's just launching that for you now. The first question is, I'm intrigued to know whether compassion was part of your everyday language before the pandemic hit. Just really interested in the word compassion and whether it was something that you used in your organizations before and was part of your everyday language. The second question in the poll, I'm really interested to know whether compassionate leadership in particular is a focus of training and development in your organization right now. And thirdly, do you believe that compassion will become a core leadership skill after this crisis? So there's 3 questions there. Just really interested in your responses, and I'd love you to just think about those and give us an answer. very simply yes, no, or you're not sure to each of those questions. And I'm just going to give some time for people to respond. I know I can see on my screen that 70% of people have voted, which is fantastic. So was compassion a word that was used in your everyday language at work before the pandemic hit? Is compassionate leadership a focus of development in your organization currently? Is it something you're focusing on right now? And thirdly, do you think compassion will become a core leadership skill after this crisis? So thanks for your votes. I'm going to end polling now, and I'm going to share the results with you. So I've just had a message pop up saying you can now also see the poll results, which is great. I'm seeing them in real time too, so let's just have a look at them. So that's interesting. So a 44%, 51% split, the word compassion was used in your everyday language before the pandemic. Now that's surprising to me. In my own work on this topic over the last 10 years, when speaking to CEOs, HR directors and managers, particularly before the crisis hit, more often than not, I was told in my own research that compassion is not a word that was seen as appropriate within business. So I'm surprised at this result and very heartened that at least 44% of you were using this term before the pandemic hit. In my own research, I found that leaders, managers and HR directors saw compassion as a term that was too emotional. They described it as overly emotional in some ways, soft and fluffy or cringy. And they preferred words like supportive, caring and friendly. So for many, they saw compassion as having no part of our everyday language in business. So this is heartening to see, and thanks for your responses to question 1. Question 2, so is compassionate leadership a focus of training and development in your organization currently? Okay, so it's only a focus of training and development in 30% of the organizations on this call. Okay, so again, that's an interesting response. So in my view, 99% of us are hardwired for compassion. 99% of us want to help others and we feel good for doing it. However, what I would call competent compassion is a set of skills that I think leaders need to develop to ensure that compassion is systemic and systematic and that it's embedded. So it's interesting to see that not many organizations among you are focusing on compassionate leadership currently. I personally feel competent compassion and the skills I'm going to talk about on this webinar when it comes to compassionate leadership are an absolute need for us to focus on moving forward. We have an opportunity to reset what we see as good leadership, and compassionate leadership is something that is absolutely at the heart of that for me. Okay, and lastly, do you believe that compassion will be a core leadership skill after this crisis? 70% of you said yes, 9% said no, and 20% I don't know. I notice in my work much more talk of empathy, compassion and humanity at work at the moment, more talk than I've ever seen before. And I'm going to argue in a second that the pandemic is changing leadership. I think it does give us the opportunity to rewrite the rules. And in my view, after this crisis, compassion will become a core leadership skill. and good leadership is going to become less being about heroic leadership and more about being human. Okay, so I'm going to stop share of these results. We're going to capture those. Just close that off. And I'm just going to move on. I just want to say that long before COVID, I think we had an unhealthy relationship with our work. Global employee engagement levels have been flat for some time, with only 1 in 7 of us worldwide across 155 countries, according to Gallup, get up in the morning and feel excited about going to work. So only 1 in 7 of us worldwide was engaged in our work. Stress-related absence was growing, and career burnout was becoming an accepted phenomena. Many of us worked in organisations that rewarded presenteeism, so being first in and last out of the office carried a badge of honour in certain industries. And I think before this crisis, we were all so busy doing, so focused on task, we were failing to look after ourselves, let alone our colleagues down the corridor. We were so preoccupied with success. I think this was driving a kind of self-focused individualism rather than what I would call an other-focused collectivism that lies at the heart of compassionate cultures. And as I said earlier, I think COVID has been a watershed and still is a watershed moment for us, resetting how we see ourselves, how we see ourselves in relation to our work, and how we see others at work. I think it's been a real leveler. I think we're realizing we're all human beings, we all suffer, we all worry, we all feel inadequate at times, and it's really bringing humanity to the fore. Because we're relating to each other virtually, I think we're seeing each other in people's homes for the first time. We're getting to know our colleagues in a different way. We might be working remotely, but our connections to people might actually be deepening. We're seeing people's kids, we're seeing their pets, we're seeing people in their kitchens, in their bedrooms. It's brought, I think, this virtual connection. There's been a lot of talk about distance, but actually there's a level of intimacy by seeing people in one another's homes that wasn't present in our interactions at work before. I also think that the pandemic is changing the way we talk about our emotions that may have been seen as inappropriate before. I think there's been a galvanizing effect, and there's a stronger sense of community and connection despite our physical distance. So this webinar's called Compassionate and Courageous Leadership. And I'm talking a lot about how the pandemic is changing leadership and bringing humanity to the fore. And I think it's also important to share what we mean by compassion. As I said before, in my research over the last 10 years or so, in many businesses, compassion was kind of disregarded, with many managers believing that showing too much kindness is weak in some way, and instead advocate toughness and strength. For us to develop genuine compassion towards others, we must first develop the capacity to connect with our own feelings and to care for our own welfare. So there's a kind of a yin and a yang to compassion, in my view. There's one part of compassion which is about ourselves, and it's this analogy of the oxygen mask. You know, we're told on an aeroplane to put our own oxygen mask on before helping others. And as a manager, a leader, or a colleague, we're no use to anyone else if we don't first attend to ourselves. So self-compassion is about giving ourselves permission just to take a moment to step back and see how things are for us mentally, physically, and emotionally. The current situation is stressful, but there are steps we can take to become more aware of how things are for us. And rather than suppressing our pain, this is about developing a kindness, a gentle attitude towards ourselves in these moments when things are tough. It's self-compassion's not about judging our emotions as they come up, but instead just noticing our thoughts and feelings as they arise. Self-compassion's also about recognizing that we're part of a bigger system. Suffering is an inevitable part of the human condition, and it's something that we all face. And as I said earlier, for me, there's a yin and a yang to compassion. And the other side of compassion is compassion towards others. And this is about developing a capacity to notice that someone else is struggling and then trying to do something to help. Compassion towards others is about sensing what might be causing someone distress and deciding in that moment what might help. Compassion, it's important to say, is more than sympathy or empathy. Compassion is about thoughtful action. Empathy is seeking to step into someone else's shoes, to take someone's perspective that might be very different from our own. Compassion goes one step further, in my view, than empathy, and it's about gestures or actions that seek to help. And I would argue that compassion is the absolute basis of our relationships at work and our ability to positively influence and relate. If we're able to bring warmth to our interactions, that helps people to connect to us. It demonstrates we care, and I also think it builds trust. That said, compassion's not just about a caring workplace. Organisations that are built around compassion have been found to generate better financial performance. They experience higher levels of innovation, engagement, client retention than those where compassion isn't embedded. And I just want to give you the example of an organisation called Barry Wehmiller. They're essentially a packaging, paper processing and engineering company. And I heard Barry Wehmiller's CEO, Bob Chapman, talking recently about their culture. They call themselves a truly human organisation, and their entire company is built around compassion. And when I was listening to Bob Chapman speak, I was struck by how he talked about resisting the natural instinct of letting people go when times are tough. He talked about his experience of the 2008-9 crisis and his experience of what's going on again today. And they've again resisted letting anyone go in the organisation. And he talked about how in the long term that hurts everyone and the damage caused when redundancies happen in terms of spreading fear across the organisation, creating disengagement and ending up with talent, some of the best people in the organisation leaving. And what I was struck by when listening to Bob Chapman speak was he was talking about everybody in the organisation as though they were a member of his own family. And he asked the question, what would you do if a member of your family was in distress? And he said, of course, we would all pull together and share the pain. And he talked about the importance of shared sacrifice, whereby everybody in their organisation takes a little bit of pain so that a few don't have to take all the pain. So he gave the example of everybody having taken a month or more's unpaid leave, and how when they did this in 2008-9, this led to a building of trust, acts of compassion, higher levels of engagement and business growth from then on, because people gave more because they felt so cared for and valued when times were tough. That said, if you're an organisation that's facing downsizing and redundancies, research has shown that if this is carried out compassionately by treating people as adults, being honest with them about the situation, communicating sensitively and carefully, and providing, for example, a generous outplacement support package, generous severance packages, this can actually positively influence an employee's perception of the organisation long after they've left. And I just want to give you another recent example of this. And this is Arne Sorensen. So he's the CEO of Marriott worldwide, Marriott Hotels worldwide. And I've shared this on my LinkedIn, actually. He gave a video address to all staff about a month ago. And despite his ongoing treatment for pancreatic cancer, Arne Sorensen decided to make this address, which is about 5 minutes long, and it's extremely heartfelt. It's a very human address where he, I think, role models his care. He's very honest about the situation and the difficulty that the business is facing in the current climate. He shows real humility and explains the importance of shared sacrifice. So, that's an example for me of how, when times are tough, if we're honest, if we demonstrate care and we treat people as adults, that is a very human way of leading in this current situation. Okay, so before I talk about the skills that lie at the heart of compassionate leadership, I just want to talk about concept of human moments that I mentioned earlier. This is a concept that I talk about in my book, and I'm often asked how I became interested in the topic of compassion. And it was actually a personal experience of my own. So I was actually widowed in my early 30s when I was 6 months pregnant with my daughter. Just show a picture of her here. This is Anna at 13 months old. And I was thrown suddenly into a period of grief and motherhood simultaneously. And I would describe myself as sleepwalking for the first 2 years of Anna's life. And it was gestures of compassion that I received from friends and work colleagues at this time, where I realized the power and importance of compassion. One such human moment was a letter I received from my then manager, which is shown here. And this moment stayed with me. The organization physically and metaphorically put its arms around me, and I realized how important and powerful compassion can be. My life has changed dramatically since then. And on this third photo, you can see this is actually Ashridge House, where I got married in 2018. On the photo, you can see my husband, Colin, to my right, my stepdaughter, Emily, my stepson, Joe, and then to my left, my daughter, Anna, who's 13 now, my stepson, Adam, and our dog, Alfie. I just want to close this particular slide by saying that my own research that's highlighted in my book found that when leaders have the courage to share a personal story of their own, to show vulnerability in some way, this creates what I call a human moment. Human moments build connection between people and can profoundly strengthen their relationships from then on. Often when we have the courage to disclose something personal, this can open up a space for someone else to disclose their own. And I think human moments are happening every day at the moment. I think there's an opportunity right now to make ourselves available for human moments every day. If we ready ourselves for compassion, if we listen with empathy and without judgment and just acknowledge the other person's experience, even if we can't change it, these can be quite powerful human moments. I just want to say that in my work over the past 10 years, I noticed that I was being asked 3 questions repeatedly by leaders. And these questions seem more important to me now than ever. And I just want to share each one of them with you now and ask you to pay attention to these questions for yourself and for those around you as you navigate yourself in the days, weeks, and months ahead. The first question is, how can you look after yourself better to make sure that you're resourced so that you can care for those around you? The second question is, how can you better support your team members right now as each one of them navigates the current crisis? And the third question is, how can you start to embed compassion in your own leadership? Compassion, in my view, is a capacity we can develop and will develop if we exercise an intention in our lives to live with compassion. And it's a leadership skill that I think will become essential moving forward. So I'm just going to share what I think are the 4 skills that underpin what I call competent compassion. And I must say at this point, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants in a sense. So this is building on the work of Jane Dutton, Monica Werlein, Paul Atkins, Mike West, and others. And when looking at their work, there are 4 key capacities or skills that I would say underpin compassionate leadership. The first is developing a capacity to notice how things are. Compassionate leaders tend to be aware and attuned to their own thoughts and emotions as they are. They notice them without judgment and adopt a kind attitude towards themselves. Compassionate leaders also possess the capacity to be present and attuned to others. They have a kind of sensitivity or an antennae that can spot signals in other people where they might be struggling. They can spot small changes to notice that something's going on for someone. The second capacity of compassionate leaders is understanding, and this is the capacity to listen deeply. I really think the capacity to listen in this way is an underutilized skill in leadership to date. Compassionate tend to inquire and ask questions gently of people, suspend judgment and interpret what people are saying through a lens of generosity rather than judgment. And the third capacity of compassionate leaders is one of empathy. And this is about seeking to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And compassionate leaders are able to really be able to take the perspective of someone else when their experience might be very different from their own. This empathizing is also about being able to tolerate distress in others without becoming overwhelmed themselves. And compassionate leaders have the capacity to do that. And finally, compassionate leaders find a way of responding that's helpful. But to do this, I would argue it takes a depth of understanding of the individual to know what's appropriate and meaningful for the person concerned. Being a compassionate leader is certainly not easy. I think it requires constant attention and a commitment to intentionally live with compassion for ourselves and others in our daily lives. Compassionate leadership is an important part of helping to create a more human workplace. But as I said earlier, there are three other pillars of compassion that we would see in what I call consciously compassionate companies. So these are the companies where compassion is embedded and is a core part of their DNA. Again, building on the work of Monica Werlein and Jay Dutton for this, I feature 3 case studies of consciously compassionate companies in my book. And what we find is consciously compassionate companies have a culture that's conducive for compassion to flourish. Companies might have the brightest visions and the best plans, but if the culture isn't conducive, compassion will never grow. Culture's intangible, but it's something that's felt, I would say, by all employees. And I would say culture is manifested through the stories that are told about the organisation, both from within the organisation and from outside it. And I just want you to reflect on your own organisation and your own culture and think about what stories will be told after this crisis. Do you think there'll be stories that you'll be proud of and stories that show compassion? Secondly, I've talked about compassionate leadership and those 4 skills of compassionate leaders, but it's important to say that compassion isn't something that can be mandated by leaders. However, leaders are an inescapable focus and are under the spotlight in organizations. Leaders have the power to facilitate compassion by the examples they set. And I think if you're in a leadership position, this is about role modeling the behaviors you want to see, showing genuine care for others, and having the courage to be honest and be vulnerable in the ways that I've talked about. Thirdly, in compassionate companies, the systems and practices that are in place tend to enshrine culture and embed compassion. And these tend to be work practices that are based on trust and respect, transparent communication, and favourable HR policies. An example I give in my book is from a small visual effects company called Outpost, who have decided to offer unlimited annual leave to all employees. And this is a real gesture within the systems and practices of that organisation of trust and care. So they say to people, take as much time off as you want and as much time off as you need to look after yourself so that you can be well-resourced to look after those around you at work. And what Outpost have found is that despite having unlimited leave, the total number of leave days hasn't actually grown. what happens in Outpost is that leave days are agreed by teams themselves. They self-organise, talk to each other and decide who's taking time off when. So it isn't escalated to a manager. They decide between themselves, which helps to spread this culture of care, compassion and trust across the business. And finally, I just want to say that in consciously compassionate companies, the networks between people tend to be extremely strong. Take the example of Cisco. So Cisco is the security and software conglomerate in the US. They have 74,000 employees, and you might expect that their strengths of ties between people, given the organization is so large, are weakened, but absolutely not. In Cisco, they call their culture a conscious culture. And there's an example in the media in 2018 where an employee reported how a leader in another part of the business who he'd never met had heard about his own daughter's life-limiting genetic condition within this Cisco network and had rallied round in her own team to raise money for her medical treatment, which Cisco then matched. So this is part of what Cisco call its conscious culture, where the strengths of people, despite it being a large organization, are really strong and news travels fast. Okay, so I'm closing off now and I'm going to be moving into a Q&A. I just want to close with a few thoughts about what you can do today, perhaps, to start leading through a lens of compassion. And I would say 4 things. I would say, first of all, show up to your interactions with people with empathy. Deep listening, I think, needs to become fashionable again. We need to develop the capacity to take other people's perspectives at the moment that might be very different from our own. We need to role model genuine care and set an example that you want to see. This is perhaps about being courageous enough to show your own vulnerability if you're having a bad day. Thirdly, I think we should all lead with humility, and this is perhaps, not about becoming ego-less. We all have an ego. Our ego is our sense of self in many ways, but leading with humility might be more about accepting that we don't need to have all the answers, inviting challenge from others, and asking others to challenge our assumptions. It's an uncertain world out there, so we need all the help we can get to see a way forward. And finally, my 4th closing thought for you is that I think we should all play our part in starting to change the language of business. In my view, some of the language we use in business isn't helpful. We talk about human resources rather than human beings. And, I would certainly say the word compassion, if it wasn't in your business before, needs to start to become central to our everyday language now. So I hope this short session has shown you the importance of power and compassion, the importance and power, I should say, of compassion at work, and the importance of connecting and caring for one another. It's at this time, in my view, it's not only essential for our collective well-being, but can also be a powerful force for good moving forward. Okay, I'm just going to pause at this point and take a couple of questions from you. We only have a very limited time. I notice we're almost up at the 45 minutes, but I do want to take a couple of questions if I can just do that. So let's have a look. lots of questions in here. Okay, so yeah, okay, so an anonymous attendee is talking about the NHS in the UK. So let me just read this question out. The NHS in the UK talks a lot about compassionate leadership, and there are many courses, conferences, etc. on this theme. However, the language used often doesn't land well with those in organisations. How can we push away the empty terminology that turns people off and speak in a language that encourages us to be better leaders and managers every day? So I'm just going to answer this question now, so hopefully you can see that. Thanks for the question. It's from an anonymous attendee, but I've chosen to answer it because our healthcare systems all over the world are creaking under the pressure of COVID at the moment. And I would absolutely agree with you that, as I said in my closing, the language of business in many ways, and as you're saying, this attendee here, the language in many healthcare environments is unhelpful when it comes to compassion. What I'd say is we absolutely need to talk in a way that's true to ourselves and do away with some of these kind of empty terms and be honest with ourselves and others. Thanks for that question. Oh gosh, another question about the language of business. So thanks for that. How can we address our very senior leaders, executive team, chief exec, chair, who publicly speak the language of compassionate leadership, but in their behaviors and actions demonstrate the opposite? So narcissistic traits that crush the messages. So wow, yeah, thanks for that question. So your questions around, you know, what leaders say versus what they do. And I'm sure everybody's experienced that in some way, you know, this incongruence between, you know, what the organizations may say they value and actually the behaviors that are tolerated. And all I can say is, I think it's Gandhi who said these words, we need to be the change we want to see, and we can only legislate for our own behaviours. So, you know, if we know we're being honest and we're using language that is true to us and we're behaving in a way that's congruent with our values, then we can start to create the ripples of change that we want to see in others. Thanks for that question. Okay, I can see lots of questions in here, but unfortunately we've run out of time. I've gone over by, gosh, nearly 5 minutes. So I'm going to close off these questions now and just say thank you to you all for joining us today. It's been a truly international audience, and I hope you found the content thought-provoking. And as I said earlier, I'm sorry I couldn't answer all your questions. Please do reach out if you'd like to pick up any questions via email or on LinkedIn. And that just leaves me to say, I wish you all well, keep safe, be kind and look after each other. Thank you for joining today.